So welcome everybody, welcome to Clay Art Centre. We're here tonight with Doug Herren. He's going to share with us, his presentation tonight is Vessels and Structures. I'm super excited I'm a big fan of Doug's work, so I'm really happy to have him here. My name is Regina Farrell-Fagan. I'm the exhibitions manager at Clay Art Centre. Back to our guest tonight, Doug Herren. Doug is originally from Kansas, and he lives and works now in Philadelphia. He is the studio technician at Swarthmore College, as well as being the adjunct at Moore College of Art and Design. He was a resident at Archie Bray, and he was a longtime resident at the Clay Studio in Philadelphia. He's an MFA graduate from Louisiana State University, and his most recent solo shows have been at Peter's project in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So he has a lot to share with us tonight. I'm going to hand it over to Doug, and Doug, whenever you're ready, you can take it away.
Share screen. And bring up this. And play. Okay, I hope everybody's seeing this. This is the first time I'm doing one of these Zoom presentations. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. I wish I could see people's faces, even if it's a small crowd or a larger crowd. It's very strange just talking into my computer like this. I'm going to be talking for just a few minutes here before I actually launch into the photos. I am 58. I grew up in Kansas. It was a very small town, 6,000 people. But from the very beginning, I had a very strong interest in art. I knew it was going to be something I'd be pursuing throughout my life. That's something I kind of discovered when I was in middle school. I think it started with comic books, really liking comic books and trying to draw things that I like seeing in comic books. When I first got interested in ceramics, though, I was in college, and I was actually a graphic design major. I went to school at Wichita State in Kansas, graphic design major for a couple of years, and took an obligatory ceramics class. Actually, it was an elective, but I just fell in love with it. I saw someone throwing on the wheel, and it's like, wow, that's something I really want to try doing. And from there on in, I was a double major for a while. Then I just dropped the graphic design. I actually had a really good graphic design instructor, but he would take us to his workshop to show us how the business worked. And I could see right then and there that, no, this is not something I wanted to pursue any further. Dropped that and became a fine arts major in ceramics, which feels like a very strange thing to tell people to do as a career choice these days. Still, I pursued it. I got my BFA in Wichita, Kansas, studying under Chris Daly. And actually this first image is Don Gauthier's work. I was trying to pull up some images of his work. He was my first instructor at Wichita State. I was there during his last year, my first year, his last year. And I really enjoyed his work. It's very large scale. His process of working was very strange. He would grind up wine bottles and mix the glass into his clay and work dry. He wouldn't glaze pieces, but the glass shards would actually bubble up and create a textured surface. But I like the architectural quality of the pieces. And it's really looking back on these things now that I feel like this is an influence that's really come back in my own work. And I'm sorry I don't have more early shots of both my undergrad and grad school work, because for me, recording anything in digital media didn't really happen until I moved here to Philadelphia, when you could start using a digital camera. I mean, I grew up with slide film and working with cameras for a long time. So I had thousands of slides of that stuff, and a lot of it I tossed out recently. I've saved a few things, but slides just aren't anything I use anymore. When I got interested in ceramics, it was primarily working on the wheel, and it stayed like that for a long time. That was my primary interest. And at Wichita State, it was a very heavy wheel-oriented program. Most of the grad students that were there, it was a grad program. I think there's like 8 or 9 grad students that were there. And I got to work with them. That was one of the things I really treasure about my time and experience there, was doing wood firings and salt firings with grad students, trading work, acquiring work. And I think that was one of the biggest helps that I had, was living with pieces that I collected from other people, because there's really nothing I think that prompts growth better than using the work that you make or that other people make. So you get a much finer sense of how to make your own work and to evaluate your own work. So this next slide is one of Chris Daly's early pieces. This is stuff that he was doing in the 80s, and I think into maybe the early 90s. Very brightly colored soda and salt fired work with heavy faceting. Very gestural work too. I have a couple images, I think, of his more recent work, which is much more subdued. He's working with stoneware, not porcelain. Actually, and when he does work with porcelain, it's actually raw clay. But the work has gotten more austere. And I apologize for the quality of this image, but this is some work actually from a very recent show that he had in New York just this past year. And now I'm launching into some of my work. So I did my undergrad work at Wichita State, graduated in '98. I stayed around there for another year, continuing to use the studio to develop portfolio work. So by the time I got to apply for grad school, I had a much better portfolio to work with, to apply for. And I applied to LSU down in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. We had a grad student that was from LSU that did their undergrad work there. And that's what interested me in that school. And what I enjoyed about working at LSU is it's a 3-year program. There's a few schools around the country that are 3-year programs. Most are 2 though. And what I really enjoyed about the 3-year program was I think it gives you more time to experiment versus a 2-year program where you have 1 year to play around a little bit. And then by the second year, you're really working on your thesis exhibition. And for me, that made all the difference in the world, having that second year to develop and experiment more. When I was at LSU, I worked with Joe Bova and Linda Arbuckle. It was their last years there. And then next year, Bobby Silverman was hired on. So he was my instructor there for the next 2 years. And grad school is very different too. In grad school, there are less instructors and more just people looking for advice. Because and Joe Bova, I thought really put it well. He says, you're really here to amaze us, astound us, just show us what you can do. We might advise you a little bit on the way, but yeah, you're here to really just play around. And I thought it was really good advice. The structure is it's just what you bring to the program to do. But I was there for 3 years, still doing wheel thrown work, but I was doing a lot more, still doing wood firing and salt firing. But I started stripping the work down in terms of not glazing as much near the end. I started using just raw clay, soda fired and wood fired without any additional glazing to it. And I'm sorry I don't have images of those pieces. What I'm showing you right now is actually work I did when I was at the clay studio. And again, that's where I wish I had more old images to show you, just to show you where some of this other work comes from. So when I got done with grad school, that was back in '92, I applied for and got accepted to my first residency at the Archie Ray Foundation in Helena, Montana. And at the time, Josh DeWeese was just beginning his tenure there. He was actually an associate, take that back. He hadn't become officially director yet. That was in the next year there. Carol Rohrbach was actually the director, but she was on her way out and Josh was filling in, and then he became the director. And it was a shock moving from Louisiana to Montana. Louisiana is very hot and humid, and Montana was completely arid and chilly. It was a very cold place. But what I loved about the Archie Ray is the grounds are located outside of Helena, Montana, about a mile outside the city. So it's a very secluded area. That's an old brick factory. And it's the residency program. There's, I think, 10 to 12 residents at a time that are year round. And then during the summer, they opened up and invite about 30 more people to come in. So during the summer, it's a really hopping place to be at. A lot of activity. You get to see a lot of really exciting work going on at that time. When I was at the Archie Ray, I just continued doing some of the things I was doing in grad school, which is still the wheel thrown work. But one of the things I started doing was to incorporate hand building into my work. I was starting to feel the limits of what I could do with the wheel. And by the time I left the Archie Ray and applied to my next residency at the Clay Studio, I was starting to really develop a body of work, and it was centered around teapots. that incorporated hand-built forms, the spouts and handles and knobs for the lids that were hand-built into wheel-thrown forms. And I continued to work on that when I was at the clay studio. So about 96 is when I came to Philadelphia, where I've lived since with my wife Kukuli and our daughter Vida. And these are some of the things that I was doing at the clay studio. And I was going back and forth between spending time working on the wheel, making pottery. It's something I've always enjoyed doing. But then I would also retool the studio so I would have these larger hand-built sculptural forms that I would make. And this is where the earliest work begins, really. This is a large platter. And I got the idea for doing this from all these handles and spouts that I'd make for the teapots. I'd do like a dozen teapots at a time, and I would make all these hand-built forms, leave them on a bed of foam to keep them preserved until the pots are ready. But I liked how they were, when they were jumbled together, how they looked. And I decided I would just make forms strictly hand-built just from these simple pieces, the handles and the spouts that were originally meant for teapots, and start to piece those together. This is a glaze-fired piece. It's a bronze glaze, about cone 9 or 10, I think. These are all hollow forms. It's about 25, 26 inches wide. And this is work that I was doing. This is actually after the clay studio. When I left in 2000, my wife and I, we bought a building, a house, a row house, 3 stories. And what we did was we renovated a little bit. So we would have 2 apartments in the upper floors, and we would have our studios. I was on the first floor, my wife was on the second floor front. So we had free studio space. The renters would help cover the mortgage. And these are some of the things that I was doing at that time. So these are the, again, wheel thrown and hand built bird baths that I was doing at that time. And these are multi-fired pieces, low fire, around cone 04 to cone 1. I would fire them up to cone 1 with this crawl glaze, and then reglaze it with the white or that blue glaze, the watery aqua glaze in the center. That would be low fire. And I was doing these for a while I was at the clay studio. It was one of the last things that I was doing last year that I was there. So you can see this piece stands about 4.5 feet tall. So these were large forms. So I would build the legs, the spout, the neck, that was all hand built. But the body, there's actually something that's wheel thrown in there, as well as the neck that's been altered a little bit. But then I would build on top of that. But I really enjoyed the hand building more and more. And I think it's just because I really like spending a lot of time on one piece, whereas in wheel thrown work, it happens very quickly. When you're throwing on the wheel, it doesn't take long. Once you get proficient working on the wheel, it comes up, set aside, work on the next piece, and so on and so forth. But with hand building, you could really slow down and study forms much more closely. So I started working at Swarthmore College as a studio technician back in 2003. And I got offered the chance to have an exhibition at the List Gallery there. And this was in 2005, I believe, when I had the exhibition. So 2004, I started beginning to make work for this exhibition. And it's a fairly large space for me. But one of the changes I wanted to make was to get away from the glazing that I was doing before. I wanted to have more control over the color palette. So what I did is just to simply switch to single firing my pieces, firing up to around cone 4, cone 5, so everything was dense. And then using oil-based enamel paints on my pieces. And then scrubbing them with steel wool to dull down the glossy finish. And this was the first exhibit that I had of this type of work that I've been making really ever since, where it's all wheel thrown and hand built, vessel forms and stands that have been painted with enamel paints. And I've really have enjoyed this particular technique because I feel like it frees me up from some of the accidental nature of glazing. For me, being able to control the color palette on these sculpture forms has become so much more important. And dispensing with glazing has actually been very freeing with these pieces. These platters, these are around 25 inches in diameter, and they're heavy. These are really kind of massive pieces, about 40, 50, 60 pounds each. And then some of the stands. The stands, for me, have always been like this separate engineering project that goes parallel with making the pieces. What I enjoyed about making these, and these are actually, there's actually 3 components, like this bronze one that you see underneath the white piece. The foot is separate, the column is separate, and the top of the stand is separate. And they've actually been epoxied together and then painted. So that was, it wasn't made as one unit. And that's one thing I enjoyed about working this way, where I started breaking forms down and working in sections. So I could actually start making larger work by breaking it down like this. And it primarily with the stands. And it's the same thing with this one. You have the top that has been epoxied on to the bottom part where it has the arc and the foot. The teapot that's on top, that stands about 2 feet, 2.5 feet tall. Just give me an idea of the size. And the stands are usually around 30 inches, 30, 32 inches in height. And again, combination, wheel thrown and hand built. I really enjoy this, being able to incorporate the wheel with the hand building. And at this point, I was really interested in this heavier aesthetic, the industrial references. And this really came from being at the clay studio every day, passing underneath the Ben Franklin Bridge and seeing all the steel girders and beams that were around this city, but the clay studio is right by the Ben Franklin Bridge. So it was actually a very imposing presence to have around you while working at the studio there. String of bases. And I was also using found lumber. Philadelphia has a lot of row houses that they tear down once in a while. And the beams, the joists from these houses are easily like 100-year-old beams from old growth forests that are about 3 inches thick. So you can rescue these beams for free if you just happen by the sites where they're demolishing some of these houses. And they just need a little bit of cleaning up, sanding. But I started using some of this wood and incorporate it into tables. This is an exhibition that I had in 2008. This was also an important one for me. I feel like the first one I had, the List Gallery, I really kind of broke through with this particular body work, but I feel like with the one that I had in 2008, I really got to develop this aesthetic a little bit more strongly. And again, with making the stands as well, the tables, and incorporating the wood, and simply bolting things together, bolting legs directly to wood. On these pieces, there's actually 2 forms. The top portion actually sets into the feet, and it's hard to tell you exactly where it fits together, but it's actually a 2-part piece. And again, it's for making something that stands 3 feet tall. In order for it to fit into my kiln, I needed to have sections. So it fits like a lid into a jar, basically. Same thing with this one. You have the foot, the middle part of the body, and then right above the neck where you see that yellow line, that's where the top part fits in. And again, it's about 3.5 feet tall, that top piece. But again, to make it fit and work into the small kiln that I had to work with at that time, I had to work with components. But I like the engineering quality of it too. That's something that's always fascinating about incorporating hand building, is there's this engineering aspect of it. Everything's drawn out. I work out designs, especially for the table legs. And the way that I work also, I don't use any molds. Everything is built from slabs. And in order to replicate the legs, what I do is I use paper patterns. So there's the back side, there's the sides, the feet, every component, there's a paper pattern that matches that. So I could duplicate legs. And I've had to do that once or twice where a leg gets broken. I can replicate that leg by using the same paper patterns and just referring back to my notes with the paints that I used. But it allows you to duplicate forms really very closely working this way. But still, everything goes back to the wheel throwing and the vessel references. I still have this affection for pottery, even though the scale is blown up. It's a teapot. It could pour, if you poured liquid into it, it could still pour out. Nobody's ever gonna do that. This is probably about 15, 18 inches in height, this set of 4 teapots. And again, this is the same show that it's nearby here. It's at the Crane building, which is a large artist studio. And what I enjoy about the show is it's all concrete floors. It used to be a factory. Crane toilets used to be manufactured there. And then it got renovated and turned into studios. In 2010, I had the opportunity to exhibit at the Philadelphia International Airport. They have a program where artists can submit work or apply for one of these glass booths, or you get assigned one, I think. I forget exactly how it worked out, but the exhibit can be up for 6 months. And I think it was one of the art professors at Swarthmore who got invited to do this. He recommended me. I applied with work that I had previous. And I told them about the design that I would like to do for this particular exhibit, and they accepted it. And I think it took about a year and a half before I could actually have the exhibit. This is shots done by a photographer that they hired. I wish I could have gotten more photos myself. Just that once the show is up, unless I'm flying, I wouldn't be able to see the exhibit. And I think I had a chance to invite people to come maybe once or twice, just for security reasons. But what I have here, you can see this long table on the right that has these 3 column forms. The table itself is 10 feet long, stands about 35 inches high, and each of those column forms is about 5 feet tall. Again, it's all components. That gives you an idea of the scale of this piece. Then on the left, there's a teapot form on top of the table. That teapot is about 4.5 feet tall. These are shots from the installation. Get a little bit closer here. The column forms, I got some more photos a little bit later on. And I still have all of these pieces. Everything's down in Santa Fe right now. I had an exhibit there back in 2018, my second solo show. But again, the same building process was used for building these legs, where I have these paper templates for all the slab that you see that compose this piece. And when I build them all at the same time. So everything's just lined up, everything gets done in the same order. That way everything matches when it's finally finished. But then it's only fired one time. I do a single firing at around cone 4 to cone 5. So it gets very dense. Any higher than that, then there'd be more warping problems. And I'm just using stonework clay, a high fire stonework clay. This teapot form. Again, this is something you can actually see the bolts on this one. It's got 1, 2, 3 components. You have the blue body, the pink spout, and then the orange neck and lid on the piece. It's the biggest teapot I've ever made. So this is another exhibit that I had after the airport exhibition. Finally getting these things out so I can show them a little bit better. These all, again, they're all components. Stacked up, there's a tie rod that runs through the entire piece. So it's all threaded together and tightens down. That top white nut actually threads on to hold everything together tight. And I got the idea for doing these when I was teaching for one semester at Baltimore, the Maryland School of Art. It was a wheel throwing class, wheel throwing for sculpture. It was a very odd one. We weren't supposed to be doing a functional pottery. It was a wheel throwing class for sculpture. And I did one project that was for stacking forms. And the one that I did is very simple, but I really liked the demo that I did. And I wanted to replicate that. And this is the one that got closest to that. And here I'm working very roughly too. So you can see all the weld marks. Again, it's just the construction process. I would use a lot of slip, attach things very directly. Slip would kind of ooze out, then I just left it alone and I wouldn't clean it up. So once I painted over it, it really looks like welded steel. Then afterwards, these are some of the pieces that I started making from about 2008, 9 onwards. I started to show at a gallery that's here in Old City. They closed recently, Snyder & Works Gallery, but I was with them for several years. And these are pieces that I started to work on for an exhibit that I had with them. These are Ewer forms. And what I started doing differently with these versus previous work was working more randomly and intuitively. So I would make all of these hand-built parts and wheel-thrown parts. And there would be 100 to 200 parts, all kept wrapped up on beds of foam. So everything stayed damp for working with. And I would usually work on 5 pieces at a time. And I knew that some part would be a spout, another part would be a part of the central part of the body, another part would be a leg, but I wouldn't know exactly how things would get assembled. And once I started assembling things, that became more fun for me in terms of I wasn't designing a particular shape. I was simply creating a lot of parts and then piecing things together bit by bit and just working more intuitively than what I had before. So there's no sketches for any of these pieces. Whereas before I usually worked everything out. For the stands that I make, there's always lots of drafts that I work out for those. But these, I really enjoyed the freedom of just piecing things together and responding to the form as it was growing. And I would have usually like 4 or 5 of these pieces going on at the same time, so they all grow at the same rate from the ground up. These are some larger vase forms. There's actually 3 here. There's a blue, a red, and a yellow one. Again, these are all done at the same time. These stand about 30 inches in height. Just to give you an idea of scale. And again, this fairly rough technique of joining things very directly, not cleaning up afterwards. And these are some of the shots when I was making pieces. I like showing these when I'm working in the studio, what it looks like. And I always feel like these are photographs I feel like where the work really vibrates because it's still damp clay and it's got this presence to it that kind of disappears after things get fired. And most everything, bisque work, things that have been fired the first time, there's a certain deadness to the work, but when it's just been built, there's a certain alive quality that it has. So this is a piece that hasn't been fired yet, but I applied the black glaze. And this is something I used to do before and I don't do it anymore, but I would apply this black glaze. So when it was fired, it looked pitch black. So when I painted over it, and when I scrubbed with steel wool, all along all those edges, you would see these black tints pop out. But I stopped doing that. For one, it's for health reasons. This is a very heavy metal glaze, lots of magnesium dioxide, cobalt. And I don't think that was probably the safest way to work. So I dispensed with that because so little was actually showing through. I decided it wasn't that necessary to keep using it anymore. So here I am working in the studio, painting the pieces. So you can see how they are fired with that black glaze. And the first coat of paint is going on. And the one-shot paints, you have to wear a respirator with. I use one-shot oil paint. They're brilliant colors. And what I enjoy about the paints is that there's no brush strokes. They're made for sign painters. So it's supposed to be very fluid. After it's applied, it completely smooths out. But the fumes are really pretty nasty. So you need a lot of ventilation. You have to wear a respirator. So after the first coat goes on, and this usually takes just a few days, 1 day in between coats, then I start applying a second coat. So with these, I have the first coat going on, legs for a stand. There's a column form. So you can see the base coats, what it looks like. When it gets done, this will be ivory. So here, aqua blues going on. So when I scrub through, you'll see patches of blue and red. So it's much more subdued. The final piece looks much quieter compared to what it looks like prior to that. And this is the actual finished column form. So you really have to zoom in on this to see all these tints, these subdued tints coming out. And this is one of the taller ones. I only used 4 of those sections too. I have a 5th one that I've never used because then it gets up to about 7 feet in height. I think it's a little bit tipsy at that point. So these are the finished painted pieces. And you can see how glossy they are. And one of the things I don't like about the sign painter's paint is that hard gloss. I go back over with steel wool. That's another day per piece, scrubbing, lots of scrubbing. Very labor intensive, this last part. And this is all getting ready for an exhibition that I had in 2012 at Sidewind Works. These bases and ewers. So here you see all these undercoats going on. They really look clownish at this point. And then once the final coat goes on, it's just a monochrome coat. And here I've used a 1 foot square block of wood to incorporate into these tables where the legs are simply bolted on. And this is actually an earlier table that I did. It's about 5 feet in circumference. It's a big one. It's one of the most engineered pieces I think I've ever done. It's a much earlier one from 2006 or 7, I think, when I made that piece. And this is probably one of the last ones that I did working in this particular style, this ivory white piece. I still use the bolts, but the rougher way of working is something I let go. And I think I wanted to let go of that because of the Trump-a-little effect, trying to look like welded steel. I thought I didn't really need to pursue that any further. I feel like I had gotten really most everything I wanted out of that. And what I started to do after this was to just clean everything up. So when I started piecing things together, I cleaned up all those joints. This is a residency that my wife and I did back in 2015, I believe, in Florida. It's a residency program. We were only there for 2 weeks. We could have been there a month, but our scheduling just didn't allow it. We were right by the beach. So we were invited to stay. It's called the Hermitage. And we couldn't work with clay. So we were all both doing our own thing. My wife was working on a series of drawings while I worked on these paper forms. So I was working the same way that I worked with clay, but this time I was using this kind of metallic paper and using aluminum tape to piece things together to create these forms. But then I would build the same way that I would build with clay. So everything was just taped together. And I left these pieces. There wasn't any need for me to bring it back with me. So in the 2 weeks, I made these 2 particular forms, these 2 ewer forms. But it's a really fun way to work. You know, you can pick it up with one hand. It was like picking up a hollow egg, very light. Let's see, this is Faenza, Italy. I applied for the Faenza Biennial, got accepted with one of my pieces. And I packed up, created the piece, got it there by FedEx just in time to get into the show. And it was really one of the first times I applied for anything internationally. And this is a ceramic shop that was in Faenza that I really enjoyed. And I wish I could have brought back more work from there. The exhibit, this is a small town in Italy, but the biennial is really well known. And I encourage anybody, look it up on the web, apply for it. They just had a biennial just recently that's opened up. And here's the biennial itself. And there's my piece right dead center. And there's a body of pieces that I made 2015. Instead of using the oil-based paints, I was using casein paint, which is already a flat paint to work with. So I didn't have to scrub anything. And this is where I first started cleaning up everything. And one of the things I was aiming for is to have something that looked visually lighter instead of having the effect of welded steel. It was more about planes and volumes and space. I felt like they're still heavy pieces, but visually I felt like these had a much lighter feel to them compared to what I was doing before. And I got to play with the color more. The oil-based paint ran more, and this allowed me to apply paint much more precisely. And that's why they're so much more multicolored than the previous oil painted pieces. When was it? I think it was the very next year. There's a art fair in Peru, Art Lima, that we applied for. And I applied for it through a friend of ours, Henry Bermudez, who has a gallery here in Philadelphia, House Gallery. He has been interested in working in Peru, and he's actually been going back a few times since. But we applied for this art fair, and we both got accepted. So we had a little booth there. And the plan was, this was in December, and the fair was going to be in, I think, April. I was going to go down there to make work, fire it, paint it, to have it exhibited there. And this is during that period when my wife found the studio for me. Since my wife is from Lima, she has all the contacts. She knows where to look. So she set me up with this studio. It was a nice young couple that let me use their studio for about 10 days. So they actually had a potter's wheel, and I started getting to work right away. There's 6 vases that I wanted to make. an older style, like what I had at the very beginning in the gallery, the List Gallery exhibit. So these are the feet. You see the bodies for the vases in the back. Here, everything's getting cleaned up. Here, they're getting assembled. So I had about 10 days to try to make everything. And then we were going to leave. And when we left, I was going to be leaving all this work at another studio to get fired. And then the plan was to come back a few days early before the fair itself to paint and scrub the pieces. It was going to be maniac work trying to get everything finished, but that was the idea. These are the handles for the vases. And here they're getting assembled. And then glazed black. So all that was left at this point was just to get everything to the other studio. And that's the last shot I have of Lima, because what happened is all that work got destroyed. And I came back to Philadelphia about a month later, and I started to make a new set of 6 pieces. And these are the pieces that I made in my studio here. Not exactly matching, but very similar. So here they are getting painted. And this is Art Lima with the new pieces. Really fun exhibiting space. This is a really wide angle shot. And there on the left is our booth. So you can see my vases, and you can see Henry Bermuda's prints. He brought down prints for himself. Had a table built. I wish I could have brought that back with me, but impossible. And these are some of the vases that I made for that exhibit. Then my wife actually applied with a piece of mine to another show that was in Altora, Spain. It was another biennial, ceramics biennial. And it's a small town outside of Castellano, but it's in an area that has a huge number of ceramic factories. Traveling from Castellano about 20 to 30 minutes to La Altora, you would see factory after factory. So it's a very ceramics intensive area of the city. And this is the museum that all these factories have basically pulled in on to build. And this is a couple of shots of the exhibit. And that's the piece that I was applied with that got accepted. And one thing I enjoyed about these particular exhibits is I left the work as a donation. So now I have pieces on permanent display in both of these places. And it's been really fun to do. Going to travel to just attend an exhibit. I believe this is still in Spain. The next international show I got to participate in was with my wife. We had a chance of doing a residency in Taiwan. And one of the things that was tied in with the residency was a chance to have an exhibit. And what we ended up doing was doing the exhibit first, but we never had a chance to actually fulfill doing the residency for it. And I wish we could have had a chance to do that. This is in Yingge in Taiwan, and this is the Ceramics Museum. They have a biennial also, and it's as famous or even more famous than the one that's in Faenza. And again, that's a really good one to apply to. And what we did is we did a joint exhibition of a few pieces for a show down there, over there, I should say. And it's also a residency program. This is Cosmos Balas, who was a resident there at that time. A few shots of Taiwan. It was fun being in Yingge. I only had like 3 or 4 days to be there. It was a very quick trip, but I got to get around quite a bit. There's a tea ceremony that a friend of my wife's who lives there now took me to. He was very friendly. She only does these private tea ceremonies. It's not for the general public, and he knows enough people to get us into it. But in Yingge, it's an old factory town, a lot of production potters that work there. And I wish I had some better shots of some of the galleries. There's a whole area of the town that just sells teapots. It's shop after shop after shop. Beautiful, beautiful work. I wish I could have bought more. I only brought a couple small pieces with me. This is, again, more work getting ready for an exhibit in Santa Fe. My wife briefly showed at Garth Clark Gallery in New York City before they closed. She had an exhibit there. And Garth Clark and Mark Del Vecchio are people that we had been friends with since that exhibit. And when they retired and moved to Santa Fe, Mark started to work at a place called Peter's Projects in Santa Fe. And he invited us to come exhibit together. So we both had solo exhibits. And these are some of the pieces that I made for that exhibit back in 2016. I know it was right after the election. I remember in November or December. But here I was trying to do something imitating what I was doing with the Kessian painted pieces earlier, where I was trying to do something more multicolored. And again, more stands. And again, these are sections. So you have the foot, the column in the center, and the top all bolting together. And again, the stands are about 30 inches in height. And these teapot mural forms, these are probably about 20 to 24 inches in height. And this is the exhibit space in Santa Fe. And it's a beautiful space. All these wood beams, wood floors, white walls. And there's my daughter at the time. She's a lot taller now. And this is that airport piece. Probably one of the best shots that I've had. This has not been a piece I've been able to photograph that well. In 2018, I had a chance to show up my hometown in Pratt, Kansas. They built a museum after 2 decades of planning. They finally got around to building it. And it's a small museum, but it's actually a very beautiful space, what they came up with. And I was visiting my parents, and in visiting the museum, I offered the idea of doing an exhibit where I would bring the work to them. I drove from Philadelphia to Pratt, Kansas with this body of work and had the exhibit. And for me, I sold one piece, my mother bought a piece. I wasn't planning on selling anything there, but just the chance to show my hometown again was really very special. I got to meet a lot of people I'd known in high school. Some of my classmates were there. I think there were like 2 or 3 classmates that actually still live in Pratt or around Pratt that came for the show. I brought those column forms from the airport exhibit as well. And these are the pieces on the stands that I made specifically for that exhibit. And then afterwards, once the exhibit came down, it was up for about 3 months. Then I flew back down, rented a U-Haul truck, packed it up, and then drove around to Santa Fe where the work exists now. And these are some working shots of these ewer and base forms, what it looks like when I'm making the components. These are all slab built. The upper left image is where everything's been roughed together. And then on the bottom right is where everything's been shaved down and smoothed out. And then just stays wrapped up until I'm ready to start assembling. And these are some of the pieces from the Kansas exhibit when they've just been assembled. Like I say, they all go together at the same time, just working from the bottom up. And I don't really have too much of a plan, except that I know what parts are spouts or necks or feet, but how things actually go together is all just improvised. These are some sketches that my wife and I worked on for a residency program in Crete, Rome. And we had a chance to go to Rome, Italy, to do a month-long residency. This is something that my wife found. And she actually found another organization that funded the trip for us. And we got to stay in this country house because the other option was staying in Rome itself, which is a much smaller space. But they said, since you're bringing your daughter with you, you will really like this space much better. And the 2 artists that run this program, this is the husband's studio that they allow artists to use. So we had this nice courtyard and we had this nice space to work in. And it was in Anguilla. That's the lake by this small town. And it's a medieval town. And there you can see it in the background. So we were living like about 10 minutes outside this little town. It was a gorgeous place to work. We had 2 weeks really to get work made. We decided to make 3 pieces based on our daughter. So my wife was working on the heads, and then I was doing the bottom portion, the stand that the head was going to rest on. And these are the components coming together. And these are the finished pieces. The heads are interchangeable, and the tops of the heads, there's a lid. Those are also interchangeable. And these are the finished pieces that we made. It's really one of the first times that we did a joint work together. And we've been trying to apply to other residencies doing the same thing. We actually got accepted to one that is in Java, but that had to be canceled. We've had things come up where we just could not get out there. But while we were in Italy, we got to travel, going to Rome, going to Florence. It was a fantastic time while we had there. And this is the exhibit that we had at the end of the stay. All the residents have a joint exhibit at the end of the residency. And it's a small studio, and it's also doubles as a classroom. So when they're not exhibiting, it's actually filled with tables, work tables. This is a current work that I have in a solo show that I've had coming up here at Gravers Lane Gallery here in Philadelphia. More vases and ewers and tables and stands. Just going to kind of fly through these. These are some of the older pieces that I had at the exhibit in Kansas. And the ewers, they're about 14 to 18 inches in height. Give you an idea of scale. This is a very large one. Here I'm using another acrylic-based paint. So it's not the oil-based enamel, which is why it's so flat. And I believe that's the last slide. Okay. Now.
Thank you so much, Doug. You're going to stop sharing there. Hit the stop share button.
There we go. Okay, I see it now.
Great. Thank you so much. From us at Clay Art Center, I have to say thank you so much, Doug, for sharing with us tonight. That was really fantastic. Thank you, everybody, for coming again tonight. And if you've been here for the first time, we have a virtual library where you can catch some of our previous presentations. And thank you again, Doug, and good night, everybody. And we'll see you back here again. Good night.
Thank you.